When fear became empire, the steppe wind carried more than dust. It carried the rumor of annihilation. Across Asia and Europe, villages whispered the same name as if it were a curse and a prophecy: the Mongols. No army in history rose so suddenly, struck so completely, or inspired such terror. Their coming was not a war. It was an eclipse. The sun dimmed, the horizon burned, and entire nations vanished beneath their hooves. The chroniclers who survived called them the scourge of God. Yet for the Mongols themselves, they were the hand of destiny, chosen to remake the world through fire. Imagine the plains of Central Asia at dawn, endless grass turning silver beneath a pale sky. Out of that horizon rides a column of horsemen, leather armor creaking, arrows glinting like teeth. They are small in number but immense in spirit, bound by something greater than loyalty, fear and purpose woven together. Their leader, Temujin, soon to be called Genghis Khan, was not merely building an army. He was forging a weapon of obedience, one that turned discipline into terror and terror into power. To him, mercy was weakness, and order was born only through submission. Every command was absolute, every defiance an act of death. The Mongols did not invent cruelty. What made them different was how they used it, with precision, with purpose, and with a chilling sense of justice. For them, pain was not madness, it was mathematics. If one city resisted, 10 were destroyed. If one general hesitated, 100 were executed. In the eyes of Genghis Khan, suffering was not vengeance, it was governance. Fear became the empire's first law, and obedience its only salvation. To the civilized kingdoms of the 13th century, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Jin dynasty, the great cities of Persia and Rus, the Mongols appeared as demons wearing human faces. Yet among their own, they saw themselves as instruments of divine will. The shamanic traditions of the steppe told them that the sky god Tengri had chosen Genghis Khan to unite the earth beneath a single eternal blue sky. In their worldview, the universe itself demanded order, and those who resisted that order deserved annihilation. Conquest was not cruelty, it was purification. When Mongol scouts approached a city, the terror began long before a single arrow was loosed. Survivors from earlier massacres would arrive, maimed, blinded, or branded, to tell their stories. Their broken bodies became living warnings. The Mongols didn't need to speak the local tongue. The language of horror was universal. Cities faced a choice: surrender and pay tribute, or resist and be erased. But even surrender offered no guarantee of mercy, for the Mongols believed fear itself was the truest weapon of conquest. Those who encountered the empire's punishments described them in whispers. Captured enemies might be crushed beneath horses, suffocated under carpets, or left in the open to die of thirst. Yet there was always order to the brutality, an unspoken logic. Pain was a message. Each execution was a sentence written not in ink but in agony. The Mongols understood something most rulers did not: that terror could travel faster than armies, and that the imagination could be more destructive than any sword. It was this mastery of psychological warfare that made the Mongol Empire unstoppable. Before their horses even reached a city's walls, panic had already taken hold. Towns would open their gates, nobles would betray one another, and soldiers would flee before the first siege began. The Mongols did not simply win battles, they dismantled faith. They taught the world that resistance was meaningless, that courage was suicide. Their enemies didn't just lose wars, they lost the idea of safety itself. But behind this machine of death was a story of survival. Genghis Khan had risen from the ashes of betrayal and exile. As a child, he had watched his father poisoned, his family cast into starvation, his wife abducted. From that chaos he learned a single truth: fear governs all men. He would wield it not as a weakness but as a weapon. To understand the empire he built, one must understand the man who refused to kneel. Every lash, every mutilation, every city burned was not born from sadism, it was born from memory. And yet, there is something haunting in the silence that followed Mongol conquest. After the screams faded, after the smoke cleared, what remained was not just devastation but order. Roads were built, trade flourished, languages mixed. The same empire that erased millions also opened the Silk Road. Beneath the surface of cruelty was an idea, distorted, violent, but coherent, that the world could be united through fear. The Mongols saw their empire not as chaos, but as cleansing. What they destroyed, they justified in the name of destiny. When we look back upon that time, it's tempting to see monsters. But history rarely gives us monsters. It gives us men who believed too deeply in their own righteousness. The Mongols broke empires, rewrote borders, and left behind rivers of blood. Yet in their own eyes, they were purging corruption, imposing divine order on a disobedient world. It is this paradox, the collision of faith and fear, that makes their story more than history. It is a mirror, because within their empire of terror lies a question that echoes across centuries. When the pursuit of order demands cruelty, does morality still exist? In that moment, as cities burned and the earth trembled under thousands of hooves, the Mongols did not just conquer nations, they conquered the human spirit. And from that conquest was born something far more terrifying than death itself, a world where fear became law, and obedience became the only path to survival. The empire of the Mongols was not founded on walls or monuments, but on obedience, unyielding, absolute, and eternal. Every kingdom has its laws, but few in history have been written with such blood as those of Genghis Khan. The Mongols called them the Yasa, and they were not carved in stone but engraved in memory, enforced not by courts but by the certainty of death. To live under the Yasa was to understand that loyalty was life itself, and disobedience, no matter how small, was treason against the universe. The Yasa was more than a code of law, it was a weaponized philosophy. Genghis Khan knew that to hold together an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian, from frozen Siberia to the sands of Persia, fear alone was not enough. There had to be order, and order demanded clarity. Under his rule, every soldier, every herder, every slave knew his place in the cosmic design. The Yasa dictated everything: how food was shared, how prisoners were treated, how horses were tended, how decisions were made, even how the dead were buried. It was a system that transformed chaos into unity, but its cost was obedience so complete that it erased the self. Among the Mongols, law was not a matter of debate, it was divine. To question a command from the Khan was not an act of rebellion, it was a sin against heaven itself. The shamanic beliefs of the steppe taught that Genghis Khan ruled with the blessing of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, whose will could not be challenged. Thus, every punishment became sacred, every execution an offering to order. Even the smallest crime, stealing a horse, lying to a superior, or failing to share food, could end in death. The Yasa demanded that justice be swift, public, and unforgettable. In this way, morality was redefined. Mercy was weakness. Justice was terror. The Mongols practiced a discipline that bordered on the supernatural. Before battle, every soldier recited odes of loyalty, binding themselves to the Khan with words as strong as steel. To flee from combat was an unpardonable offense. Even if one warrior ran, his entire unit might be executed. This was not cruelty without reason, it was control through consequence. In the Mongol army, the collective was sacred, and the individual expendable. Unity was enforced not through loyalty alone, but through the knowledge that a single mistake could doom everyone. The result was terrifying precision, an army that moved as one body, unflinching, unstoppable, and utterly obedient. It was said that when a general disobeyed a direct order, even victory could not save him. In one account, a commander who entered battle without permission won the fight but was executed upon return. His triumph meant nothing, for he had placed his will above the Khan's. To the Mongols, victory achieved through disobedience was defeat. They believed that the universe itself would collapse if hierarchy was broken. And so, through these acts of punishment, Genghis Khan forged something rarer than loyalty, faith in fear. Yet there was a strange beauty in this system, one that outsiders could never fully understand. The Yasa was cruel, but it was also just, at least by Mongol standards. It did not discriminate between noble and slave. If a prince stole from a commoner, he died as swiftly as any peasant. If a general failed his men, he suffered the same fate as they would. The Khan demanded not blind brutality but balance. Justice, in his mind, was the perfection of obedience. In that way, he created an empire that was both merciless and fair, a contradiction that terrified the world. The punishment rituals themselves were carefully orchestrated. Execution by strangulation, beheading, or trampling beneath horses were common, but never arbitrary. The manner of death carried symbolic meaning. To spill noble blood was taboo. Royal captives were often killed by suffocation under felt carpets, ensuring that no drop touched the earth. This was more than superstition. It was ritual purification, a way to honor the sacred while destroying the profane. Through such acts, cruelty became ceremony. Every execution was both a spectacle and a sermon. Ordinary crimes met with equally merciless precision. A thief might have his hands crushed beneath stone. A liar could be mutilated to ensure he could never deceive again. Adultery, betrayal, or cowardice were punished by slow death, sometimes by exposure, sometimes by starvation, sometimes by methods so brutal that chroniclers could barely write of them. Yet to the Mongols, these punishments were not excessive. They were balance restored. The steppe was a place of harsh winds and endless horizons, where weakness meant death, and strength was the only virtue. The Yasa was the embodiment of that world, a reflection of nature itself, cold, vast, and impartial. Even mercy was codified in terror. When a city surrendered peacefully, it was sometimes spared, but only if it submitted completely. Any sign of deceit, any rumor of hidden resistance, was met with extermination. Whole populations were slaughtered for harboring fugitives or withholding tribute. To those under Mongol rule, obedience became survival, and survival demanded silence. Fear became the language of governance, and it spoke fluently across cultures. Chinese bureaucrats, Persian scholars, and Russian princes all learned the same lesson. To serve the Khan was to live, to hesitate was to die. What made this system so devastating was its efficiency. The Mongols did not need prisons or elaborate courts. Justice was immediate and irreversible. There were no appeals, no second chances, no bureaucracy to slow the blade. The simplicity of the Yasa was its genius. It turned every subject into both enforcer and captive. People policed themselves, for they knew that a single whisper of disobedience could condemn their families. Through this culture of fear, Genghis Khan achieved what empires for centuries had failed to do: absolute control. And yet, beneath the surface of terror lay something more profound. The Yasa gave structure to chaos. It unified tribes that had spent centuries in blood feud, replacing vengeance with law. It demanded respect for women, outlawed the theft of livestock, and punished corruption with death. In its brutal way, it imposed equality on a world that had none. To the Mongols, it was not tyranny, it was harmony enforced by violence. What outsiders called barbarity, they called order. What others saw as moral collapse, they saw as divine balance. The empire of obedience was not built in a day, nor by a single man's will. It was born of centuries of survival on the steppe, where law and life were indistinguishable. Genghis Khan merely gave form to what every Mongol already knew, that fear sustains order, and obedience sustains life. Under the Yasa, morality ceased to be a question of good and evil. It became a question of loyalty and betrayal, of service and rebellion. In this world, justice was not blind. It was watching, always, waiting for the slightest crack of defiance. And so the Mongol Empire grew, not through mercy, but through the ruthless precision of law. From the heart of the steppe, a new kind of civilization emerged, one where morality bent beneath authority, and obedience became the highest virtue. Those who lived under the Yasa learned to worship its terror, for it was both their god and their executioner. In the empire of Genghis Khan, the law was written in blood, and every drop spilled was a reminder that the greatest cruelty of all is not chaos, but perfect order. They called it the theater of terror. For the Mongols, torture was never random, never the product of unthinking rage. It was an instrument, an art of control, perfected to speak across languages, cultures, and faiths. They knew that a single body in pain could accomplish what 1,000 swords could not. It could conquer the imagination. The Mongols understood that the fear of death was powerful, but the fear of what came before death, what the human mind could not predict or endure, was absolute. Their cruelty was not blind, it was staged, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Before a Mongol army attacked, the first weapon unleashed was not the arrow or the blade, but the rumor. Terror arrived days, even weeks, ahead of them. Stories spread like wildfire, of cities erased, of children impaled, of rivers running red. Some of these tales were true, others were inventions whispered by terrified survivors. The Mongols encouraged both. They knew that the human mind builds horrors greater than any army could create. When their scouts appeared on the horizon, entire towns would surrender without resistance, preferring slavery to the tortures they had heard described in trembling detail. In this way, fear traveled faster than horses, devouring nations before a single wall was breached. Those who did resist were made into lessons. The Mongols never wasted a punishment. Every act of torment was public, theatrical, and symbolic. When they captured rebels, they did not simply execute them, they made them examples. Prisoners might be tied to stakes outside the city walls, left to die slowly under the sun as the wind carried their screams into the streets. Some were mutilated, their eyes gouged or ears cut away, then released to wander, living warnings of what defiance cost. These survivors were messengers of despair, spreading stories that magnified the Khan's power beyond mortal measure. Witnesses described these scenes in tones of disbelief. When the city of Merv fell, the Mongols gathered its defenders and forced them to dig their own graves before being buried alive. In Nishapur, they piled the skulls of the dead into pyramids, grim monuments meant to speak for generations. In Herat, they blinded tens of thousands, sending the maimed survivors stumbling across the desert to carry the tale of Mongol vengeance. These were not random massacres, they were messages written in flesh. To conquer minds, the Mongols had to turn terror into language and language into law. Their methods were precise, almost scientific. During sieges, captured envoys might be executed in front of city gates, their bodies mutilated in deliberate patterns. Sometimes they would be skinned alive, their hides nailed to the walls as grotesque warnings. Others were tied behind horses and dragged across the plains until nothing remained but a trail of blood and dust. The purpose was not simply to kill, it was to display. Every act of torture became a performance, every victim an unwilling actor in the empire's grand theater of fear. The Mongols knew that pain alone was not enough. It had to be witnessed. The greater the audience, the deeper the submission. When they executed traitors or rebellious lords, they did so in front of the conquered populace, ensuring that every gasp, every tear, every trembling silence became part of the ritual. The execution ground was sacred space, a stage upon which the Khan demonstrated the futility of resistance. The Mongols believed that to see suffering was to understand truth, that order was born from fear, and peace was achieved through horror. Even the way they used the battlefield was psychological warfare. They would encircle an enemy, feign retreat, then return like a storm. They burned crops, poisoned wells, and released captives deliberately, crippled, maimed, or maddened, to spread panic among the next city's defenders. These survivors were the living instruments of propaganda. The Mongols rarely needed to storm a city twice. Once the mind had been conquered, the body followed willingly. Chronicles from Persia and China describe scenes that border on the unimaginable. In some places, Mongol commanders ordered entire populations executed, but spared a handful, always a handful, to spread word of what they had seen. They told of families burned alive, of prisoners flayed and left hanging from the city gates, of generals forced to watch their own soldiers tortured before their turn came. Yet behind this nightmarish cruelty was strategy, not madness. Genghis Khan understood that the key to victory was not endless war, but the appearance of inevitability. If the world believed resistance was suicide, then conquest would become self-fulfilling. There is a particular cruelty in making death predictable, but pain uncertain. The Mongols excelled in that. Victims never knew what form their suffering would take. Sometimes they were crushed beneath horses, sometimes stretched until their joints snapped, sometimes boiled alive in oil or water. The Mongols took their time, ensuring that every scream carried far. But even then, there was a sense of order. Every act of torture had a purpose: to destroy morale, to warn others, to erase dignity from the defeated. Death itself was often merciful. It was the anticipation, the waiting, that broke men long before the end. To the Mongols, fear was an empire's most renewable resource. It required no forges, no fortresses, no taxes, only imagination. Once planted, it grew on its own, feeding on memory and rumor. Even decades after the Mongol armies passed, entire regions remained haunted by their legend. Farmers would abandon fertile fields, believing the soil itself cursed by the blood spilled upon it. Parents told their children to obey, or the horsemen of the steppe would return. This was not myth, it was policy. The Mongols built an invisible empire of memory, a dominion of terror that endured long after their physical presence vanished. Some chroniclers, writing centuries later, struggled to understand how such cruelty could coexist with such brilliance. They saw in the Mongols both savagery and genius. And perhaps that was the true horror, that these acts were not chaotic, but calculated, not expressions of rage, but of reason. The Mongols revealed something uncomfortable about human nature: the realization that terror, when organized, becomes one of the most efficient tools of civilization. They weaponized psychology long before the word existed, turning fear into the purest form of control. And yet, behind the spectacle of pain, there was always silence, cold, deliberate silence. The Mongols rarely shouted or boasted during their executions. They observed, as if conducting a ritual, their faces expressionless, their discipline unbroken. In those moments, they seemed less like men and more like instruments of some higher law. To them, cruelty was not pleasure but necessity, a sacred performance required to maintain the balance of power. Theirs was not sadism born of emotion, but cruelty born of philosophy. In the end, the theater of terror was not merely about the destruction of enemies. It was about the transformation of humanity itself. By making pain a language, the Mongols reshaped how power was understood. They proved that an empire could be built not only on loyalty or faith, but on the simple, unrelenting certainty of fear. Theirs was a rule that did not just crush the body. It conquered the mind, leaving behind an echo that would outlive their empire by centuries. The world has seen many tyrannies since, but none have wielded horror so artfully, or understood so deeply that the most perfect torture is not of flesh, but of the soul. They called their punishments inventions of hell, and even hell might have turned its eyes away. To the Mongols, pain was a message, and the body was its parchment. Torture was not random, not indulgent. It was crafted with imagination, precision, and purpose. What emerged from their empire was not simply cruelty but innovation in cruelty. The chronicles that survive, Persian, Chinese, Arabic, and Russian, speak of methods so deliberate, so artistically brutal, that they defy belief. Whether all were true hardly mattered. In the medieval world, belief itself was a weapon, and the Mongols wielded it with terrifying mastery. There were tortures meant for spectacle, tortures meant for discipline, and tortures meant purely for terror's whisper to spread beyond the reach of their arrows. One of the most infamous among them was known later as the Iron Mare. Captives, often traitors or rebellious nobles, were bound beneath galloping horses, their limbs shattered and bodies crushed beneath hooves. It was both execution and performance. The sound of bones breaking beneath the thunder of hooves was meant to echo across encampments, a grim symphony of order. The Mongols did not flinch. To them, this was not cruelty, but the restoration of balance. To defy the Khan was to disrupt harmony, and such chaos could only be answered with annihilation. Another punishment reserved for betrayal was skinning alive. In Persian chronicles, it was said that city governors who defied Mongol authority were flayed, their skins nailed to the city gates as warnings to their successors. The act was ceremonial. The victim was often forced to watch the preparation of his own execution, the sharpening of knives, the laying out of wooden boards, the gathering of witnesses. His skin was then peeled with steady precision, not in rage but in ritual. Sometimes the Mongols would stretch the flayed skin over the governor's chair, placing his replacement upon it, a silent lesson of loyalty. Truth or legend, the message was the same. Disobedience lived forever in pain. Boiling, too, became one of their signature punishments. Captives, particularly those accused of defiling sacred sites or betraying alliances, were lowered slowly into vats of boiling water, oil, or molten metal. Chroniclers wrote that the Mongols believed the agony of boiling purified the soul, burning away treachery before death. To the onlookers, it was theater, proof of the empire's power to unmake a man in both body and spirit. But even more chilling was how calmly it was carried out. The executioners moved with ritual grace, as though performing an ancient liturgy, not murder. The horror lay not in the screams, but in the composure of those who caused them. Not all punishments were quick. The Mongols had a taste for endurance, the slow unraveling of life. Some prisoners were tied between two bent saplings, which were then released to tear their bodies apart. Others were buried alive up to their necks, left for the sun, insects, and scavengers to finish what the executioners had begun. In the deserts of Central Asia, such victims could linger for days, their cries carried by the wind across the dunes. To the Mongols, their suffering was not wasted. Each death became a lesson, a monument invisible yet unforgettable. Fear did not require stone to endure, it only needed memory. The Mongols were also masters of symbolic punishment, pain designed to communicate moral truth. Adulterers might be trampled by camels, thieves crushed beneath loaded wagons, liars forced to swallow molten lead. The symbolism was clear, the punishment mirrored the crime. To deceive was to burn from within, to steal was to be broken beneath the weight of one's greed. In their brutal logic, these acts were justice, not savagery. To outsiders, it was barbarism. To Mongols, it was cosmic symmetry. One of the strangest, most terrifying punishments recorded was suffocation under carpets. Reserved for nobles and kings, it reflected the Mongols' taboo against spilling royal blood. Victims, often defeated monarchs or rebellious princes, were wrapped in thick felt carpets, then trampled or crushed until life left their bodies. The symbolism was layered. The earth drank no royal blood, the heavens received no plea for mercy, and the act left no visible stain. The Mongols could claim honor even in murder. To those who witnessed it, it was horror masked as ceremony, death made quiet, orderly, and absolute. In some cases, the Mongols used their enemies' own fears against them. When they invaded lands steeped in superstition, they tailored their tortures to the culture's beliefs. In Muslim cities, they desecrated holy sites and executed imams publicly, breaking the people's spiritual will. In China, they humiliated captured scholars, burning their books before forcing them to kneel in ash. The Mongols understood that to destroy faith was to destroy resistance. Pain inflicted on the body was fleeting, pain inflicted on meaning was eternal. The scale of their atrocities blurred the line between history and myth. Chroniclers wrote of cities where the Mongols executed every living thing, down to animals and infants. Others claimed they filled rivers with corpses until the water ran thick as blood. Though some of these accounts were exaggerated, their purpose was clear. The Mongols wanted to be feared more than understood. In their eyes, horror was not evil, it was efficient. An army that terrifies does not need to fight every battle. Terror itself becomes the empire's invisible army. Yet amidst this monstrous theater of torment, there was an eerie restraint. The Mongols rarely tortured for pleasure. They were not sadists in the sense of chaos or indulgence. Every act of pain was functional, part of a system that replaced diplomacy, justice, and morality with a single governing principle: fear sustains order. This cold detachment is what made them truly terrifying. A tyrant driven by emotion might be reasoned with, but a ruler who tortures without hatred, only to maintain structure, is beyond comprehension. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was the psychological torture inflicted upon survivors. Entire populations were forced to witness executions, sometimes compelled to participate, digging graves, carrying stones, or chanting the name of the Khan as their kin were slaughtered. By turning victims into accomplices, the Mongols broke the human bond itself. In their world, even innocence was a weapon waiting to be turned inward. This was not just conquest of land, it was conquest of the human conscience. As word of these punishments spread, distant cities trembled long before Mongol banners appeared. Generals surrendered without a fight. Kings sent tribute from fear alone. Chroniclers from Baghdad to Kiev recorded the same pattern, whispers of unspeakable tortures spreading faster than any army could ride. Even those who had never seen a Mongol came to fear them as if they had. The terror became self-sustaining, a myth that moved on its own, like smoke that never clears. In time, historians would argue which stories were true and which were inventions. It no longer mattered. The Mongols understood what few conquerors ever did, that the imagination is the greatest instrument of torture. A single rumor, repeated often enough, could subdue an empire. Whether they flayed every traitor or only a few, whether the Iron Mare ever truly trampled its victims, the result was the same. The world believed. And in that belief lay submission. The invented horrors of the Mongol Empire were not simply tales of darkness, they were strategies of rule. Genghis Khan and his successors weaponized the human need to understand suffering, turning it into obedience. They made pain into policy and terror into art. By the time their empire reached its height, the Mongols no longer needed to invent new tortures. Their reputation did the work for them. The myth itself had become the ultimate instrument of fear, a legacy of horror that outlived the empire, echoing through centuries, reminding the world that sometimes the most powerful tortures are the ones we only imagine. When a Mongol army descended upon a city, it was as if the earth itself had turned against humanity. The horizon filled with dust, the air thickened with the scent of iron, and before the first arrow was loosed, the people inside already knew there would be no mercy. The fall of cities under Mongol siege was not war. It was extinction, a ritual of destruction executed with mechanical precision. In every city that dared resist, the Mongols performed a terrible liturgy, and the gods of the steppe demanded blood as their offering. To them, conquest was not merely about victory, it was about example. Each city that fell served as a sermon to the next, a living warning that mercy had died and fear now ruled in its place. When Genghis Khan's armies marched westward, they did not come as conquerors seeking plunder. They came as instruments of judgment. The empire's expansion through Central Asia was marked by massacres so complete that even the chroniclers struggled to comprehend them. In 1221, the ancient city of Merv, once one of the jewels of the Islamic world, met its end beneath Mongol hoofs. The citizens had resisted, trusting their walls and their faith. When the gates finally fell, the Mongols gathered the population outside the city. Men, women, and children, hundreds of thousands, were separated by profession. Artisans were spared, marched away into slavery. The rest were executed methodically. The Persian historian Juvayni wrote that every Mongol soldier was ordered to kill 3 to 4 people, and that afterward, not a cat or dog remained alive. When the slaughter was done, the city was set aflame. For years afterward, travelers spoke of a silence so deep that even birds would not land where Merv had once stood. Nishaper's fate was worse still. The city had surrendered, only to rebel after the Mongols withdrew a portion of their forces. In retaliation, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, enraged by the death of a Mongol commander, ordered every inhabitant killed. It is said that over 1 million people died, though the number may be symbolic rather than literal. The Mongols piled the skulls of the slain into pyramids outside the city walls, their white bones gleaming under the desert sun like monuments of obedience. Each skull became a warning, each pile a proclamation that defiance would not be forgiven. The chroniclers wrote that the Mongols laughed as they built their towers of death, not from joy, but from a sense of cosmic justice. In their eyes, the city had chosen rebellion and thus chosen annihilation. Baghdad, the crown of the Islamic Golden Age, the city of scholars, poets, and saints, met its fate in 1258 under Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, lulled by arrogance, refused to believe that the Mongols would dare attack the heart of Islam. When they arrived, Baghdad's proud walls crumbled within days. What followed was not merely a conquest, it was a cultural apocalypse. For 7 days, the Mongols slaughtered indiscriminately. Streets ran with blood thick enough to turn the Tigris dark. The caliph himself was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death, his body buried in the ruins of his empire. The House of Wisdom, the great library of human knowledge, was thrown into the river, its books bleeding ink into the current. The waters ran black, a survivor wrote, and then read. Knowledge itself drowned beneath the tide of Mongol vengeance. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these massacres was not their violence, but their order. The Mongols did not kill in frenzy. They killed as accountants of death, efficient and emotionless. They divided cities into quotas, each unit of soldiers assigned a number of victims, each street systematically cleared. When the executions were complete, they moved on, leaving behind landscapes of silence. To the Mongols, there was no chaos in destruction. It was the final stage of conquest, the sealing of fate. Once a city was erased, it could no longer rebel. Terror was not an accident of war, it was its purpose. Survivors described scenes that defy imagination. Entire families burned alive in their homes. Priests nailed to their own temple doors. Wells choked with corpses so that no one could drink from them again. Yet what truly broke the human spirit was not the killing itself, but the realization that resistance meant erasure. The Mongols would offer surrender, sometimes even promise safety, but once a single arrow flew against them, the promise was void. There was no appeal, no negotiation, no divine intervention. Under the law of the steppe, rebellion was sin, and sin demanded purification through fire and blood. The fall of each city was not a battle, it was a ritual cleansing. The Mongols turned annihilation into art. Their sieges were methodical, combining advanced engineering with primitive terror. They used captured civilians as human shields, forcing them to push siege towers or fill in moats while Mongol archers rained death from behind. Those who refused were killed on the spot. Once the walls were breached, the soldiers were allowed to plunder, but only for a fixed number of days. Afterward, discipline returned. The Mongols would rebuild parts of the city for their own use, transforming centers of life into outposts of empire. It was as if they believed destruction and creation were inseparable, one feeding the other, like twin gods devouring the same offering. In the wake of these massacres, the moral order of the known world collapsed. Scholars, monks, and poets who had once written of divine justice now questioned whether the heavens had turned away. Chroniclers in Persia wrote that the wrath of God had taken human form. In Europe, the Mongols were believed to be the armies of the apocalypse, heralds of the final judgment. Yet the Mongols themselves saw no contradiction between faith and violence. To them, their victories were proof of divine favor. Genghis Khan had declared, "It is the will of heaven that I rule." If entire cities had to perish for that will to be fulfilled, then it was not cruelty, it was destiny. Even after death, the conquered were made to serve the Mongols' message. The skull pyramids left outside ruined gates were not monuments of pride but tools of governance. They told the next city what words could not. Submission was survival. When the wind blew across the plains, it whistled through empty sockets, carrying the memory of terror farther than any messenger could ride. The Mongols had discovered the ultimate form of communication, language written in silence, carved in bone. And yet, hidden beneath this horror was a grim logic. The Mongols believed that true peace could only exist when all resistance was extinguished. They saw mercy as a lie, a weakness that invited rebellion. By destroying cities completely, they believed they were creating stability, a world united under fear, yes, but united nonetheless. Their cruelty was therefore not chaos but ideology, a philosophy that fused destruction with order. The fall of each city was not merely a victory of arms, but a statement of faith, that fear was the purest foundation of empire. After the dust settled and the bodies were buried, or left unburied, the land itself seemed to remember. Travelers spoke of fields where nothing grew, of rivers that changed their course to avoid the dead. The Mongols had not just conquered nations, they had scarred the earth. But perhaps their most enduring conquest was of memory. Long after their empire fractured, the stories of those massacres endured, whispered by survivors and carried across continents. The Mongols had shown the world that the death of mercy was not an end to civilization, but its transformation. In their hands, terror became a language, cruelty became policy, and the ashes of cities became the ink with which history would forever record their power. The Mongol relationship with torture and punishment was not merely about domination, it was about transformation. They believed that pain was not random cruelty but a tool, a ritual capable of purifying, testing, and reshaping the soul. Just as they forged their empire through fire and steel, they used both elements, fire and ice, as instruments of control and cosmic balance. In the vastness of the steppe, where nature itself was brutal and indifferent, the Mongols learned that survival depended on mastering the extremes. Their punishments reflected the same philosophy, a world where warmth and cold, mercy and pain, life and death were not opposites but two halves of a single eternal cycle. Among the most terrifying punishments in Mongol tradition was the boiling cauldron. This gruesome method was reserved for traitors, spies, or those who dared to deceive the Khan himself. The condemned would be placed into large iron cauldrons filled with water, milk, or even oil, then slowly brought to a boil. Some chroniclers, like Giovanni, described scenes where prisoners were forced to watch their comrades die first, skin peeling away, screams muffled by rising steam, before being lowered in themselves. To the Mongols, this was not senseless brutality. Fire was sacred. It symbolized purity and the judgment of heaven. A man boiled alive was not simply killed, he was cleansed, his deceit evaporating into smoke that rose to the sky. The Mongols believed that the flames, being holy, would carry his soul upward, delivering it to the eternal blue heaven, after it had been stripped of every earthly sin. But not all punishments used fire. In the heart of the steppe, ice was equally feared. During the harsh winters, when the wind howled across frozen plains, Mongol captors would use the environment as their executioner. Prisoners might be stripped naked and bound to frozen posts, their bodies left to stiffen in the unrelenting cold. Others were doused with water and left overnight, encased by dawn in a glistening coffin of ice. This was not merely death, it was transformation. To die in ice was to become part of the land itself, preserved in silence. Mongol shamans saw the cold as a spirit of purification, a way of freezing the corruption within the soul. Even in punishment, they sought balance. Fire burned the wicked, ice preserved the worthy. Both served the cosmic law of harmony between destruction and creation. One particularly horrific method combined both elements, the trial of elements. In this punishment, the condemned was placed inside a pit, alternating between exposure to fire and freezing water. Mongol commanders used this not only as execution but as interrogation, believing that truth could only emerge when the body was stripped of all comfort, all illusion. Victims would scream confessions to crimes both real and imagined, their words mingling with steam as heat and frost devoured them in turn. This ritual reflected the Mongol belief that the body was a bridge between the physical and the spiritual world. To break the body was to release truth. To destroy the flesh was to free the essence within. The Mongols also practiced the punishment of silence. A victim's mouth would be filled with molten lead or sealed with heated metal, ensuring they could never speak again. This was often reserved for those who had spread lies or insulted the Great Khan. In Mongol cosmology, the spoken word had power. It was a force that shaped reality. To misuse it was to violate the balance of the universe. Silencing the offender through pain was not merely retribution, it was restoration. By closing the mouth, they believed they were closing a wound in the moral order. Even their cruelty had a strange, theological symmetry, a logic rooted in their reverence for power and harmony. There are records, too, of punishments designed to erase a person not only physically but spiritually. One such execution involved the burial of the breathless. Victims were wrapped tightly in animal skins, usually raw cowhide, and left under the sun. As the hide dried, it constricted, crushing the body and suffocating the victim slowly. This was seen as nature itself reclaiming the offender, squeezing them back into the earth that gave them life. Fire burned, ice preserved, but the hide suffocation bound the human to the animal realm. The Mongols, deeply animistic at their core, believed that this punishment returned the offender to primal origins, a fitting end for one who had betrayed the human order. Another infamous method of purification was the breaking of the horse. The condemned was tied to 2 or 4 horses, which were then driven in opposite directions, tearing the body apart. This practice, shared in part with other nomadic cultures, was not random savagery. The horse, in Mongol belief, was sacred, a companion spirit, a symbol of freedom and the steppe itself. To be killed by horses was to be judged by nature's most noble creature. In some cases, this punishment was carried out at sunrise, the moment when the light first touched the horizon. The Mongols saw it as the breaking of falsehood by the dawn, when the truth of the world revealed itself through the destruction of the unworthy. It was brutal, yes, but also ritualistic, a cosmic performance of justice. Fire and ice were more than instruments, they were the Mongol Empire's moral vocabulary. To outsiders, their punishments seemed monstrous. But to the Mongols, they were acts of balance. In their cosmology, existence was a circle of opposites: heat and cold, birth and decay, mercy and terror. The great Khan ruled not only by sword but by the harmony of these forces. A stable empire required not just conquest but cosmic order. Torture and execution became tools to maintain that equilibrium. Each punishment was both spectacle and sacrifice, designed to remind the living of their fragility and their place in the eternal cycle of power. When we read these stories today, they shock us not only for their cruelty but for their coherence. Every Mongol act of punishment carried meaning. Fire cleansed, ice preserved, the horse judged, the hide reclaimed. Nothing was wasted, not the body, not the spirit, not even the lesson of fear. The victims became symbols. Their agony was a message that traveled farther than any soldier could. To defy the Mongols was to defy the natural order itself, and to face both the flames of heaven and the frost of earth. As the empire expanded, so too did its rituals of destruction. In China, Persia, and Eastern Europe, these punishments took on new variations, adapted to the climate and culture of each conquered land. In the frozen steppes of the north, captives were left buried to their necks in snow, their breath freezing midair. In the deserts of the west, victims were tied under blazing suns until their flesh split and blistered. Yet in every version, the essence remained unchanged. The punishment always echoed the land. The Mongols were masters not only of war but of environment. They knew how to make nature itself complicit in their cruelty. But beneath this terrifying logic lay a deeper truth. The Mongols had grown up in a world where life was constantly tested by fire and frost. Survival demanded endurance. Suffering was not exceptional, it was expected. Their punishments reflected that worldview. They did not invent pain, they revealed it. They believed that every human carried within them both fire and ice, and that the truest power lay in mastering both. The tortures of the Mongol Empire, then, were not only about fear. They were lessons in the ultimate duality of existence, a dark mirror held up to creation itself. In the end, the rituals of fire and ice were more than cruelty, they were metaphors for the empire's soul. The Mongols saw themselves as the bringers of balance in a chaotic world, the hands of heaven enforcing divine order. Through agony, they believed they purified the world of weakness. Through destruction, they believed they created stability. And in the echo of screams carried across the frozen plains and burning deserts, one could hear the heartbeat of a civilization that found meaning in suffering and harmony in horror. To understand the Mongol Empire's cruelty, one must first enter their sacred mythology, the invisible world that justified the visible horrors. For the Mongols, pain was not meaningless. It was a form of communion with the divine, a mirror of the suffering endured by their gods and spirits in the eternal sky. Above all others stood Tingri, the eternal blue heaven, unseen, infinite, and indifferent. Tingri was not a god of mercy, but of balance and will. To live under his gaze was to accept both victory and agony as sacred gifts. The Mongols believed that those who suffered were being tested by heaven, and those who inflicted suffering were carrying out its command. This was the paradox at the core of their faith. Pain was not evil, it was proof of divine attention. From childhood, every Mongol was raised to see endurance as holiness. The biting cold of the steppe, the hunger of winter, the sting of the whip, all were lessons sent by Tingri to harden the body and sharpen the spirit. When Genghis Khan declared that, "Heaven has destined me to rule," he wasn't boasting, he was confessing faith. His power was sacred, his conquests an extension of the cosmic order. To defy him was not rebellion, it was blasphemy. Thus, every punishment the Mongols delivered was not only lawful but spiritual. They believed they were instruments of divine will, enforcing cosmic justice through the language of suffering. The Mongol spiritual world was animistic and shamanic, filled with spirits that embodied nature's cruelty and beauty. Fire had a soul. Water had a will. Mountains were alive, watching silently. Even death was not an ending but a transformation, the passage of energy back into the eternal cycle. The shamans, the intermediaries between the physical and the spirit world, often guided how justice was executed. Before a major punishment or execution, they performed rituals to ask Tingri's approval. Smoke from burning herbs would rise into the night sky, carrying prayers to the heavens. If the smoke drifted smoothly, it was taken as a sign of divine favor. If it faltered or broke apart, it meant the spirits were displeased, and the punishment would be delayed. This belief turned torture into liturgy, each act of cruelty framed as a sacred dialogue between man and the divine. There are accounts of Mongol warriors entering battle with offerings of their own blood, cutting their palms and letting it drip upon the earth before riding into combat. The gesture symbolized surrender to fate, a pact with Tingri. Pain was not weakness, it was language. To bleed willingly was to speak directly to the heavens. The Mongols extended this same theology to their enemies. When captives screamed under torture, they believed those cries echoed upward, reaching the divine. Each scream was a message, a declaration of the empire's devotion to the will of heaven. Thus, when a man was flayed alive, his agony was not meaningless. It was ritualized prayer, the sound of justice being performed under the eternal sky. Even Genghis Khan's own suffering was mythologized. The legends say that as a child, Temujin, his birth name, was captured and enslaved by a rival tribe. He was chained, beaten, humiliated, but he endured without breaking. The shamans later interpreted his survival as a sign that Tingri had chosen him. Pain had not defeated him, it had sanctified him. From that moment forward, Genghis believed that suffering was the forge of destiny. He told his generals, "He who cannot endure pain cannot command men." Every hardship endured by the Mongols, every lash of the steppe wind, every scar on their bodies, all became proof of their right to rule. Their gods did not protect them from pain, they demanded it as tribute. This theology reached its darkest expression in the punishments carried out against those who defied the Khan's sacred rule. To the Mongols, executing a traitor was not vengeance but sacrifice, an offering to balance the cosmic order. The victim's death released energy back into the universe, appeasing Tingri's hunger for harmony. Sometimes, they even performed these executions beneath open skies, believing the heavens needed to witness justice firsthand. In one ritual, the condemned would be suffocated beneath felt mats, a punishment meant to avoid spilling blood on the ground, since the earth itself was considered holy. By killing without letting blood touch the soil, they honored both Tingri above and the Mother Earth below. Even in their cruelty, there was reverence. The Mongols' understanding of pain also drew from their mythology of heroic endurance. Tales of Borte Chino, the blue wolf, and Gua Meral, the white doe, the mythical ancestors of the Mongol people, taught that life itself began from hardship. The wolf, a sacred symbol of ferocity and survival, was both protector and destroyer. To the Mongols, to kill like a wolf was divine, and to suffer like a wolf was sacred. Pain, therefore, was not merely human, it was cosmic inheritance. Warriors prayed to the wolf spirits before battle, asking to be filled with their strength. When prisoners were torn apart by horses or flayed alive, Mongol chroniclers wrote that their spirits were returned to the pack. The boundary between human and divine dissolved in the howling wind. This worldview was not unique to the Mongols, but they perfected it through conquest. Other cultures separated God and man, The Mongols fused them. Their Khan was both ruler and priest, executioner and prophet. Each decree of torture carried the weight of heaven's command. The shamanic rites that accompanied punishment were designed not only to terrify but to sanctify. Before a city was annihilated, offerings were made, sometimes a white horse, sometimes a drop of fermented milk poured into the fire. The Mongols sought permission from Tingri before unleashing devastation. Once granted, they believed the slaughter to come was holy, even merciful in its finality. Perhaps the most striking element of their faith was the belief that pain revealed truth. A person's final moments exposed their soul. If one died silently, enduring agony without scream or curse, it was believed that their spirit was strong, perhaps even worthy of rebirth. But if one screamed in despair, they were seen as weak, unbalanced, and unworthy of the eternal sky. This belief added a cruel irony to Mongol executions. The more a victim suffered, the more they were judged by the way they faced it. Their torment became both punishment and test. For the Mongols, how a man died mattered more than why he died. In the empire's later years, as Mongol rulers began to adopt Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, traces of their original cosmology persisted beneath the surface. Even when they prayed to new gods, the old spirits of the steppe remained. The eternal blue heaven was never forgotten, it was simply renamed. The idea that suffering sanctifies power endured. Whether through the Buddhist notion of karma or the Islamic concept of divine justice, the Mongols continued to see pain as a pathway to purity. The old gods lived on, disguised in new theologies, whispering that power and suffering were eternally bound. This spiritual acceptance of pain explains why the Mongols' cruelty seemed limitless. They did not see their actions as evil. They saw them as necessary sacrifices in the service of order. Just as the gods demanded storms to cleanse the sky, so did the empire demand blood to cleanse rebellion. In their eyes, they were not destroyers but instruments of balance. When a city burned, when prisoners screamed, when the air filled with the smell of death, these were not signs of chaos. They were signs that heaven's will was being fulfilled. And yet, hidden in this faith was a haunting reflection of humanity itself. The Mongols believed their gods suffered with them, that even Tingri's eternal sky wept storms when the balance was disturbed. In this way, cruelty became a form of devotion, a shared pain between man and the divine. Every act of torture, every sacrifice, every death, all were echoes of the same belief, that to suffer was to touch the infinite. Their gods of pain did not ask for worship through prayer, but through endurance. They demanded not love, but strength. And in serving them, the Mongols created one of the most terrifying paradoxes in history, a civilization that found holiness in horror and divinity in the breaking of the human soul. When the Mongol Empire reached the height of its power, mercy vanished from their world. Under Genghis Khan's law, compassion was weakness and fear was order. Cities that resisted were erased, their people executed as warnings. Justice no longer meant fairness, it meant obedience. To defy the Khan was to defy heaven itself, and such defiance demanded punishment beyond imagination. The Mongols perfected cruelty into strategy. They believed terror could achieve what treaties never could. Their executions, their public displays of suffering, their merciless destruction of empires, all served one purpose: control through fear. And it worked. Entire nations surrendered at the rumor of their approach. But beneath this absolute dominance, humanity withered. When cruelty becomes law, even the victors are enslaved by it. The Mongol strength was absolute, yet it devoured them from within. The death of mercy brought order, but it also brought silence, emptiness, and the slow decay of the soul. In killing compassion, they secured their empire. In doing so, they sealed its fate. When the Mongol Empire finally fell, it left behind not just ashes, but a lesson carved into the memory of humankind. Their reign had proven that mercy can die, not in an instant, but slowly, beneath the weight of fear, power, and necessity. They believed cruelty was order, that pain preserved balance under the eternal blue sky. And for a time it worked. Their world obeyed because it trembled. Roads were safe not from kindness, but from terror. Yet from the ruins of their conquest rose something unexpected: reflection. The world they united through blood and fire also became the first truly connected world, where trade, language, and culture crossed borders born of fear. Ironically, the same hand that killed mercy also built bridges of exchange and knowledge. Centuries later, the echo of their logic still lingers, that fear sustains power and mercy endangers it. But history whispers a different truth, that every empire built on cruelty eventually consumes itself. The Mongols taught humanity its darkest lesson, yet in doing so, they forced the world to rediscover compassion. The death of mercy was not its end, but its rebirth, a haunting reminder that even in the shadow of the cruelest empire, the human heart still seeks light.